We have a very fine set of panelists for this discussion this evening. If you would like to come on up and take your seats at the table as I introduce you, people will then be able to recognize you. State Senator John Fonfara is a Hartford resident. He represents Hartford and Wethersfield in the state Senate, where he's been serving since 1997. He was in the State House of Representatives for about 10 years before that. He's the chair of the Finance, Revenue, and Bonding Committee, and he's been instrumental in tackling issues such as energy and education. Hartford Councilor Wildelis Bermudez is also a Hartford native and a community advocate who fights to improve public schools and environmental management. She was elected to the council in 2015 as a member of the Working Families Party. She serves as communications director for the Connecticut League of Conservation Voters. Councilor James Sanchez is a Marine Corps veteran. He's majority leader of the Hartford City Council, on which he has served since 2015. His day job is as a technician in the Utility System Monitoring and Surveillance Department of the Metropolitan District Commission, or the MDC as it's better known, and he's active as a community volunteer. Melvin Medina serves as the Director of Strategic Initiatives for the American Civil Liberties Union of Connecticut. He leads the organization's efforts to create and maintain community engagement. And Mr. Segun Idowu is joining us from Boston. He founded the Boston Police Camera Action Team, which sought to increase police accountability through the use of body cams. And he's also served as vice president of the Boston area NAACP and as the executive director of the Black Economic Council of Massachusetts. Is Assistant Chief Thodi here? Would you like to come on up? In your programs, it may list Hartford Police Chief David Rosado as one of the speakers, but as most of you probably already know, he has submitted his resignation and will be moving to the security department at Pratt and Whitney, and so his replacement in the interim is Assistant Chief Jason Thodi. We want to welcome you all to this panel.
Great. So our goal tonight, of course, is to have a...
Let's start off by talking about the plans to use drones in Hartford, and then move on and talk about the proposals for regulating the use of those drones. I'd like to start off with Senator Fonfara. You were instrumental in securing the state funding for this project, including the purchase of 2 drones. Can you tell us what it was that prompted you to encourage the city of Hartford to start using surveillance drones?
Absolutely. Through my long career as a legislator representing the city of Hartford, I've made quality of life issues one of the focus of my work, believing that the people of Hartford, the residents of Hartford, deserve the same quality of life as any community surrounding Hartford and any community in Connecticut. And that folks do not have to leave the city of Hartford in order to live in peace and safety, and have their children be able to play in the neighborhood, have their property be protected, that everyone who lives in Hartford, whether they own a home or rent, whatever their circumstance, that they would be able to have an acceptable quality of life in the city of Hartford. And I've worked to try to bring resources back to the city for those purposes. One example, you may be seeing more speed tables in Hartford, because so many of my constituents have said speeding is a big problem in Hartford, and the speed tables was one of those manifestations of trying to address the problem. It doesn't fix it entirely, but it does. And it's all been community driven, folks saying, constituents of mine saying that this was an important issue. Similarly, with respect to bikes and quads and those kinds of vehicles that have at times taken over the streets of Hartford illegally, endangering people who are walking, moms with children. These marauders go down the street, go down sidewalks, and they know that the police cannot chase them. There is a no chase policy not only in Hartford but for most places, if not all places around the state. And they flaunt the law and endanger our quality of life, endanger public safety. And I've spent some time trying to identify ways to not apprehend so much, but to discourage this kind of activity in the city. And I felt the drone was a means to do that, where police are not chasing, police are not waiting somewhere with the hope that they could apprehend someone when the vehicle's gas runs out or what have you. And so that's why I sought funding for drones for the sole purpose of discouraging this activity from happening, much less in terms of apprehension of folks, but to let them know that they may go somewhere else, but Hartford is not a place where they should be doing this.
So thanks very much, Senator. Chief Thody, can you give us an idea of how the police department will be using drones, how they fit into the overall surveillance operations of the department?
Sure. So as the senator said, this was something that came from a discussion on quality of life and trying to be creative about how do we curb especially quad and ATV usage in and around our parks in a safe way. We can't pursue those vehicles. It's not wise to pursue them even if we could. But this was an opportunity. We found that the best way to try to find out who's doing it and try to hold them accountable was to wait until the vehicles stop. In some instances, that meant in an area where they had a trailer and they were loading the vehicles to take them back to another location. In other issues, in other instances, it could have been bringing them back to somebody's house and parking them behind the house. And at least we'd know where that operator or that rider was so that we could go back there and find them and try to prevent the future behavior. So it really didn't, it really is not a surveillance operation more so than a technology tool. We've had a great deal of success in the city with technology like ShotSpotter and cameras and things like that. We thought this was another tool where we could kind of work smarter and not harder. Chief Rosado and I both are open to ways to utilize a drone that is a collaborative effort between us, the community. We have sat down with members of City Council. We've sat down with members of the ACLU through City Council. We don't want to, this is not an effort that the police department intends to shove down anyone's throat. We want to make sure that we're doing this for the right reasons and that it has regulations in place that allow us to use the drone. There's a lot of uses for it. Missing persons, there's been successes in using it for missing person, reduced liability even in vehicle pursuits. There's a lot out there that we could use these drones for. But we want to make sure that the community is trusting that we're using them for the right reasons.
Thank you very much, Chief. There was some talk last year that the fire department as well might be using drones. And we have Chief Reginald Freeman from the fire department here with it, sitting over on the edge where he can make a quick escape if the fire alarm goes off. So could you tell us briefly what the situation is with the fire department and drones?
Thank you, Mr. Dunlap. So the fire department originally was interested in pursuing drone technology for two reasons. One, to assist with locating missing persons in the event that we were called to do so. Naturally, that would be done in conjunction with the Hartford Police Department. And secondly, probably more importantly, and would have been used for this purpose more frequently than any other, was for the safety of the firefighters. The drone that we were looking to procure was a drone that you can go on eBay right now and buy for anywhere between $3,000 and $10,000. And it even goes up from there. More importantly, it would have a forward-looking infrared camera on the drone, which we commonly refer to as a FLIR camera, which we would utilize to look at the heat signatures on roof lines, so the incident commander can make a determination if it was time to pull firefighters out of a structure because of an impending roof collapse. We had procured our FAA license. We also had gotten clearance already from Bradley as well as Brainerd Airport. However, we tabled our pursuits pursuing the drones in light of the community discussions of not only drone but also surveillance technology. The fire department will not procure a drone or technology to be used as such until the city does have a plan in place that will actually ensure that the fire department and the police department are using the drones as they are intended to and approved by the citizens of Hartford. Lastly, the actions that we have taken, getting the permit, the proper license from FAA, clearance from Bradley and Brainerd, has not incurred any cost to the taxpayers of the city of Hartford.
Thank you very much, Chief. The plan that Chief Freeman and the fire department are waiting for is exactly what we're going to be talking about now. There are two ordinances before the City Council, and the choice between those is essentially the topic of this program tonight. One of them would leave the regulation primarily to the police department, and the other would have the City Council with much more active oversight. And so we'd like to talk to the two sponsors of those bills and see if we can get an idea of what they're proposing and the differences between them. Councilor Sanchez, would you like to describe your proposal?
Yes, my proposal is basically straight to the point. Where I like to see whether it's the fire department or the police department, in this case it's the police department, where they can create a policy following the state and federal regulations. We all know we cannot supersede any of those policies or regulations. And therefore I feel that if we were to adapt the other ordinance that's been submitted, this will create an oversight over the police department, and I disagree with that. I believe that the reason why we have a chief, an assistant chief, and deputy chief is because they are the leadership and authority as to what should be done and the creation of a policy that's effective when it comes to using drones. If this was the case that we were going to create an oversight of a department, then we might as well, in my opinion, create an oversight for every single department.
And Councilor Bermudez?
Yes, thank you. So it's more than just the two ordinances that we have before us, and it's more than just drones. This encompasses a bigger conversation about public safety and surveillance technology as we know it in terms of its use for the city of Hartford. And the timeline that we've been working with, it's not just about Hartford, it's actually about the entire state of Connecticut. Because in the last 5 years at the state level, there has been no legislation, when we're talking about drones, there has been no state legislation that has been enacted at the state level for the use of drones. So that means that it's up to us at the municipal level to decide how our city departments are going to be using drones. And so when my colleague, Councilman Sanchez, mentions that we will defer to the federal, the FAA, and state standards, yes, we will absolutely defer to the federal standards. But as it stands right now, there are no state standards. So it's really up to us at the city level to decide what we want to do. Now, when we're talking about our ordinance, and when I'm referring to our ordinance, I introduced it along with other colleagues, Councilman T.J. Clark, Councilwoman Arjo Winch, Councilwoman Claudine Fox, Councilman Larry Deutsch. And so there's 5 of us who introduced what I'm going to refer to from now on as the long ordinance. The long ordinance is over 13 pages long, and specifically it points to checks and balances. Oftentimes, what happens at the city level is when we receive grants, and we welcome these grants because they're important to us, when we receive grants, the city council would approve the grant. And so in the case of the drones, in the case of also body cameras, which we also received a state grant for, and the list goes on and on. You can list an entire multitude of different surveillance technology that is being used. But when we receive these, the City Council ultimately approves the grant for the purchase of such surveillance technology. In the case that we've seen, in my ability as a councilwoman in the last 3.5 years that I've been in this position, the grants are oftentimes very rushed. So for instance, with the drones, we literally only had less than a week to actually vote on it. There was no public input. The same was also true for the body cameras. There are many different examples that I can point to, but I will share with you those. The long ordinance, what it stands for is to create a system of checks and balances so that we don't defer only to the police department to write the policy. Yes, we would love for the police department to write the policy, but we want to make sure that we have public input in the process. We want to make sure that there are adequate reporting measures. We want to make sure that there's an automated way to capture the data, the pre-flight, the post-flight. We're not just talking about drones, though. We're talking about drones and surveillance technology overall. We want to know how the surveillance technology, what kind of impact is it having on the ground? Is the surveillance technology, when it's new, is it actually benefiting us? Are there specific areas in the community that are more prone to the use of surveillance technology by specific departments like the Hartford Police or not? There's a specific provision of sets and regulations, and there is a fact sheet for you to delve into in your packet. Thank you.
Chief Thody, can you describe to us the police department's position on this, any planning that you've already engaged in, and the sort of policies that you would be likely to adopt?
Sure. So initially, we, in receiving the funding, our C4 folks, Sergeant Mastriani is in the crowd here, looked at drones that would meet the kind of the requirements that we were looking for the quality of life enforcement that we received the money for. And they went out and they found a company, and we began looking into that, the feasibility of getting that drone here. It was an out-of-country company because of some of the requirements that were put forward about how high it could fly, how long it could stay in the air, that it could be tethered. So there was a technology look. Second look was a policy look. We have a planning and accreditation division within the police department, and we tasked them with going out and finding some best practice policies. Places like the International Association for Chiefs of Police have a library of policies that other accredited agencies look at. We are seeking accreditation, so we wanted a policy that was in compliance with accreditation, both state and national. So the second part was policy, and like I said earlier, we had some policy discussions with folks from City Council about what we wanted to achieve and whether we could or couldn't achieve it based on some of the regulations that were out there. We've also recently, I think it was about 3 weeks ago, myself and Chief Rosado went down to Washington, D.C. To participate in a discussion of law enforcement across the country on drones. The Police Executive Research Forum, commonly known as PERF, put this on and invited departments to come in and kind of talk about what does and what does not work. We engaged with departments that have had success with the drone program. Wilmington, Delaware, Virginia Beach, the Michigan State Police. There's a few of them out there that have some pretty comprehensive drone programs, and I think that kind of changed our view a little bit too. We got to engage with the FAA down there and talk about the licensing requirements of what it actually takes to license our officers to operate the drones. So it's been a fairly comprehensive process to this point. Again, though, with the discussions that have been going on, we have not purchased a drone, much like Chief Freeman mentioned, from the fire department, because we want to make sure that we do this the right way the first time.
So I want to shift to talking a bit about surveillance technology and public input issues in general. So specifically, I'll ask a few of the panelists to explain their views on whether there should be a process of public input or public information when it comes to implementing new surveillance technologies, and if so, why? And I'd love to start with Mr. Medina from the ACLU, please.
Hey, beautiful people. Thank you for coming out. So I want to kind of formalize my thoughts in 4 points as quickly as I can. First, let's start with the history of where we are. The Surveillance Center, also known as Fusion Centers, started with it started in 2013 in Hartford. It's been paid for through a combination of local taxpayer, state taxpayer, and federal taxpayer dollars. It's more than just drones. This conversation that we've had so far has only been about drones, but as the Councilman Bermudez mentioned, it's a surveillance center that has access to, there's differing accounts, but anywhere between 600 and 800 city cameras. It's a surveillance center that has video analytics software that essentially can pick out people based on clothing or differentiating features, and it can track where you were over the last 24 hours. They could literally spot you in the city among those cameras. So that beautiful yellow shirt that I see over there, if I type that into the software, reviewing the past 24 hours of surveillance, if you walked around the city, I can pinpoint your exact track throughout the entire city. And the software can do that in 5 minutes. That's one piece. The other piece I want to add to this is that while the Hartford Police Department has said that it is now going to be adding facial recognition technology, the software that they do have, which is called BriefCam, in its most recent updated software, which the department has already said they do not have, does have facial recognition technology. Regardless of the intent of the department, the opportunity or ability to upgrade that software to include facial recognition technology is present. So that's just like a history of how we got here, okay? What concerns me, now let's talk about intent, because oftentimes there's a large conversation about what is the intent of the use of technology. What we need to establish, though, is regardless of the intent of whether it's the fire department, of the police department, intent has nothing to do with guidelines. Guidelines are actually safety measures that are put in place that regardless of the intent of police department or the fire department or any other city agency, there are guidelines within they need to fit within that they can use that technology. So intent is important. The ordinance that the council members have introduced in long form gets at this issue of creating safety nets, right, in which the departments need to function. It sets there's two really important pieces to it. The first part of the ordinance establishes essentially a democratic process. It requires that before any surveillance technology is purchased, that agency, that city agency, has to go to city council with prepared use policies, impact reports about how this will impact your civil liberties and privacy. It needs to be voted on by council. A public hearing would be required so that you, as community members, myself as a Hartford resident, have the opportunity to weigh in on that discussion. In addition to that, it includes public reporting. The second piece of that ordinance is really also an important piece. It regulates the use of drones. It essentially sets guidelines, 8 exemptions in which the police department or any city agency can use drones in. What's important for y'all to know about this is, one, I applaud the council members because they did their research. What I'm holding here is a report by our state legislature on drone use regulation recommendations back in 2014. This was done by the Legislative Program Review and Investigations Committee, a committee that Senator Fonfara actually sat on when this report was issued. In this report, they establish use policies that they think state and city departments should be using when using drones. The ordinance that's here before you incorporates all of those recommendations. So that's an important piece I just want to throw out there. I think the second piece is I want to respond to Councilman Sanchez's point about that the city council should defer to the police department in terms of how they use, in terms of their regulations or policies. And that simply is not actually the precedent in this city. One is that's not how democracy works. The city council is the legislative branch, and the mayor is the executive branch, and they check each other, and they get to decide what policies look like in our city. And as a Hartford resident, the city council and city hall is the natural people's building in which I can go to express what I want to see in my city, right? So this ordinance gets at the democratic control of policing. The other thing I want to say about that is if you want to check it, there's section 2917 of the Hartford Municipal Code clearly delineates guidelines, safety guidelines in which the Hartford Police Department need to operate in if they're going to send out a police detail, if there's a business or a place of operation that's having issues with public safety. So there is precedent already for the city council to set safety guidelines, requirements that the department needs to follow to make a decision. So it's not a great point. It's established. We can do that. The last thing I'll say, because I went on for a long time, apologies, is that what we have happening here should be happening at a public hearing, and it should be voted on. What the city council doing is exactly the process that we want to see. We want democratic control over local government. That is why we advocate. That is why we are tax-paying residents. This process should have happened 2017 when this grant first came to the city council. That did not happen. The only reason the police are at this table is because advocates on the ground pushed this issue and forced them to this table, because they did not come out and do this in the beginning. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Mr. Medina. So it would be great if we could have the elected officials respond, but I am actually first going to go to Mr. Itawo, just because, again, time check, it's 6:24, and I want to see perhaps there'll be some questions from the audience with respect to these issues for the elected officials. So. Turning to Mr. Itawo, there's been a lot in the news about the use of police body cameras nationwide, but Boston took a very intentional approach to public input on implementing this new technology, or at least that's what my notes say. You can correct me if I'm wrong. So can you tell us about the Boston Police Camera Action Team and what Hartford can learn about how Boston residents and the police sort of came to an understanding around this new technology?
The first thing I'll say is everything this guy said. That was amazing, and I agree with just about every point. I can hop on the train back home now. First, I want to thank the councilwoman for the invitation to be here this evening, as well to Hartford 2000 for holding this conversation, to the moderators and the panelists for joining. I'll just say very briefly, my grandfather lived in Hartford for 30 years. He lived on Euclid Street. He was the former pastor of Pilgrim Way Baptist Church over in Windsor. And so while I do live in Boston, grew up in Boston, Hartford is another home for me, as we would come up just about every quarter to visit him. So I'm happy to see family and friends in this audience this evening. A little bit on the Boston Police Camera Action Team. So I will amend a little bit the introduction there about Boston taking an intentional approach and build on what my friend here said, that advocates forced that conversation in Boston to happen about body cameras. So on August 9th, 2014, everybody in this room was introduced to a young man named Michael Brown at the moment of his death. And so a good friend of mine, Shakia Scott, who was the co-founder of this organization, we all saw live as images of his body were popping up on Twitter, and we saw the reaction of family and friends and residents in Ferguson. And so the first thing she said to me was, "We're going to Ferguson." And I said, "Well, if you're paying for the ticket, I will absolutely take the free ride, and we'll go down and we'll protest and work with the residents there." But after further conversation with her, we decided that we were going to stay in Boston and prevent a Michael Brown from being shot and killed on a popular street there named Warren Street, or a Tamir Rice from being killed in one of the local parks, or a Sandra Bland from going missing on one of our main roads and ending up dead in one of our prison cells. And so we decided that one of the ways to make that happen, because we know that there is no silver bullet to the scourge of police violence against black and brown residents of this country, decided that body cameras were one way to address this issue. This was also because many people across the country were talking about the fact that body cameras would help us understand, would have helped us understand what happened with Michael Brown and Darren Wilson, because it wasn't a he said, she said story, it was a he said, because the other person was dead. And so because of that one version, everyone, New York Times, mainstream media, et cetera, were putting up body cameras as a way to resolve these issues in the future, that at least if some terrible violence occurred against a black or brown resident, we would have some third party, some evidence of what actually transpired. And so rather than pushing against the argument against body cameras happening at all, we decided that it was important for us to write the rules and regulations that would guide the presence of body cameras, knowing that we're going to have them anyway. So whether or not we had body cameras at that time in 2014 or 2024, they were going to be here because the natural state of technological advancement, that they were going to become a part of the police toolbox. So decided that we should write the rules because while officers may be wearing the cameras, we're the ones on the other end of it. They're going to be in our communities. And so therefore we should have access to this footage, that we should be able to dictate when it's on and off, whether or not officers should have to give, whether or not we should have to give consent for being on these cameras, et cetera. So we met with members of the ACLU, the local NAACP, and the Harvard Black Law Student Association, and began to research all of the 4 policies that existed in the country at that time, and put together our own policy. And we brought this to the City Council, again, building on what Mr. Medina said in terms of having our democratic rights realized through the council as the legislative body, and forcing this essentially on our police department because, again, you know, we do pay taxes, and so decided that we should be the ones writing the rules of how these tools are used in our community. The mayor and the police commissioner were dead set against us. And therefore, there were several other council members. All of the councilors of color supported us, and all the others did not. And so we decided that we were going to still try to push this through. Eventually, because of gaining traction, of building relationships with the local Black Lives Matter chapter and many, many other advocacy organizations, eventually the mayor and the commissioner got a vision from heaven and decided one morning to write an op-ed in the Boston Globe saying that they'd been for body cameras all along, and that they were looking forward to working with advocates to writing the policy and making body cameras happen. And so that effort started in 2014. In 2018, the mayor announced that he was devoting $3 million to a body camera program, and so now we're working with the local commissioner to ensure that the policy that they enact, we're pushing for 100% of what we put together. For the pilot program, they adopted 60% of it. We're pushing for 100. But all I will say is this, it is not up to our elected officials to abdicate their responsibility. All of us go out and vote and participate in other ways of being civically engaged to ensure that our ideas and views and perspectives are respected and realized in real time and on a real level with police officers and every other city department. So I will say that I respect what all of my colleagues on the panel have said tonight, but I will say that when it comes to the police department, there is no other department I know of that has the right to kill you and get away with it, and so therefore it is up to the citizenry of every community to determine what the rules and regulations for that department should be.
So before we turn to questions from the community members, I wanted to ask Chief Thody what's happening here in Hartford with body cameras at this juncture.
Sure. We went through what turned out to be a pretty long process. We didn't have framework in place. We had to negotiate the wearing of the cameras with our Hartford Police Union. We had to go through the process of procurement, of looking at what's out there for technology, what would best fit in Hartford. We went through, we had many community discussions that dated back long before we had the ability through our negotiations with the union to even wear the cameras. NRZ meetings with some of our leaders in the community about the you know, kind of the pros and cons, and some of the messages that I've heard up here are consistent with what we found. This is a body-worn camera program is not a silver bullet to solving any large-scale issue in law enforcement, but it is another tool that can be helpful. So similar to the process that we go through in a lot of this technology that we think is important. We made sure that it was what folks were looking for. Went through a policy procedure, went through a procurement procedure. One thing was true is that we were up against a pretty strict deadline when it came to being reimbursed for portions of our body-worn camera program. Made those deadlines. I mean, we had to be fiscally responsible in the in the pursuit of these cameras, so that we could make sure that we leveraged our partners to reimburse the city. Selected a vendor, went through the actual receiving of the body-worn cameras, and then we just completed a 1-month trial program where about 20 of our officers wore the cameras and filled out evaluation forms at the beginning and ends of their shifts relating to a whole host of concerns, both internally and externally, how they worked, are they turning on? Are they turning off? How they should? All that stuff. And now we're this month in looking at that first evaluation period, and then the plan is to roll them out for the rest of the department.
So thank you all very much. We're going to turn now to some of the questions that came up from the audience. I have 2 questions here that deal with roughly the same subject, so I'll bounce from one to the other. Surveillance technology is helpful for public safety, but it can also help reveal police misconduct. What we've seen here and elsewhere is that the police and prosecutors won't release surveillance videos that shows such misconduct without a court order or public pressure. How can we be sure that the Hartford Police Department will preserve and release video footage of this sort? And another question asked it somewhat more succinctly, which is who will police the police? Who gets to see the drone footage? Can we start with you, Chief Thody?
So I think here in Hartford, when it comes to video footage of police misconduct, we've been as transparent as any other department I've ever seen, and transparent, period. We've had issues of misconduct caught on tape. It's an unfortunate situation, but it happens. And we've released that video. We not only have released that video, but we've brought in members of City Council. We've brought in members of our religious communities and community leaders to review that video with us and explain what we thought. And that's something that we've done. Now, I think the concern that comes into play is in the state of Connecticut, we have a situation where if our officers are involved in a shooting, either serious physical injury or death, we don't investigate that. In the interest of being an independent, having an independent review, the Connecticut State Police comes in and investigates that. So I do think that there is some frustration there when that video is not released by another agency that's outside of our control, whether it be the state's attorney's office or the state police. That's not how we've generally handled it, but it is the reality of having an outside agency that comes in and looks at your review. They have control over that investigation. So that has happened. It has not happened through the decisions of the Hartford Police Department.
So I think that this question could be directed to all 3 of the elected officials, and I'll let you decide the order that you go in. And that question is sort of twofold. First was, what was or will the remainder of the $1.9 million of the Quality of Life grant be used for? And then second to that, why wasn't there a community discussion before purchasing drones? So there are 2, one sort of fact-based question and one about the public input question.
The funds that I obtained, I think it was $2.25 million. $2.5 million was a Quality Life grant that the community did participate in around not just my district, by the way, which I have about 65% of Hartford, but throughout the city. NRZs participated actively in the discussion of how the funds should be used. Again, some of it was used for speed tables, some of it for the drones, and some of it for cameras that would be used in neighborhoods. And many, the police department can speak to this better than I, but many residents wanting cameras at their homes because there isn't the fiber on the street to be able to use the cameras effectively. And so this was a very democratic process that was engaged in by the NRZs throughout the city of Hartford. Many residents making decisions as to what they wanted to see the funds used for.
I would add that while the NRZs are extremely important and vital, the NRZs are one platform, but there are many different groups that exist in terms of reaching out to the overall Hartford community. And so at the city council level, when we submitted the 2 ordinances, the long ordinance that deals with surveillance technology and drones, and the short ordinance that would defer for the police to write what the law would be. When we had our one public hearing in November of 2018, one of the things, the general sentiment, was that people were actually confused across the board, regardless of where they stood, regardless if they were supporting one ordinance or the other. During the public testimony, we heard from residents who said, wait, we're going to purchase drones? When did this happen? And so I'm saying that example because when we're thinking about a democratic process, we really have to be very intentional about the way that we're outreaching to our entire community. Our community, it just can't be one demographic. Sometimes we're told that we live in two different Hartfords. A pastor actually said this quote. He said, "We live in one Hartford where it's free and another Hartford where you can't walk as freely." And so at the city level, when we receive this kind of feedback, for me and for other members on city council, we really want to make sure that when we talk about a public input process, that it is done in different areas of the city and with more input and weigh-in from all sorts of individuals, students, from all over, not just one demographic, but all over the city that also have weigh-in. We have such a rich and diverse immigrant community as well. We have very vulnerable populations. We have reentry population. We have homeless population. We have all walks of life that live and congregate and live here. They work here. They do business here. And it's very important for us to do outreach in all regards. And so when we received this grant, this particular grant, drones, but also with the body cameras, it was a rush process. We had less than a week to vote on it, and we did not have a public input process when it came before council. Folks were literally confused.
Thank you.
Could I just say that with respect to the 2.5, there was no rush regarding that. I can't speak to the body camera process. I think that was different. That was federal dollars. But with respect to the 2.5, there was no rush to that. It was a very long process of community engagement. I did not decide that process by any means. I just sought the funds, and then the process of the community speaking took its course, and maybe it was not as robust as it could have been, but that was not an intent. There was no intent behind that process to limit participation.
So, can you hear me? Yeah. All right, so Senator Fonfara just took some of the words out of my mouth. It was not a quick process. The money sat aside for over a year into the community that we reached out to, whether it's through NRZ, Facebook, and family and friends. We've all tried our best to reach out to the community, but you can't force the community to come to a meeting whether they know about it or not, and that's been a challenge in itself. I think one of the main reasons here that we're here, and by the way, before I continue, can I get a show of hands, because this is a policy. This is about one drone that we're talking about, not drones. That
2 drones.
Well, one is aerial, the other is not. So, being that this is about Hartford, can I get a show of hands? Who lives in Hartford? Everyone that's here, please, thank you. I really appreciate that you're here. I appreciate that you're here because it's important to me that our Hartford resident know what's going on here. And I also believe that we should have our towns and neighbors here as well, but specifically our Hartford residents. So I think one of the main issues here truly is about privacy and immigrants. Because I support the drones. I support it because my priority as the chair of public safety and quality of life is the security of my folks here that lives in this city. My priority is to make sure that we are all safe without losing our privacy. And the short version, we have the long version, but the short version is, in fact, directing the police department to follow every state and federal regulations. And that's including, I believe, is 1971 Privacy Act. Everything needs to be incorporated, is what my ordinance is stating, all right? We have policy set in place that we, as the council, have to enforce. But again, like I said earlier, we're not here to be an oversight of any department. That's why we have leadership. If you can't trust your leadership, then why do we have them? The council is also a leadership here in the city. The mayor is another administration. That's a leadership. And to Mr. Martinez, right? Medina, I'm sorry. To Mr. Medina's point, the council is the check and balance to the mayor, all right? And that's a fact. So now we are elected officials. We're elected because we are trusted. We are trusted with hard decisions that we have to make in this city. But the decision is for the overall community, not just one individual, not just one group. It's the overall community. And I believe that if we have the drone and utilize it correctly without violation of privacy, without using it for facial recognition, by the way, we're all on Facebook, so it doesn't matter, to a sense, I should say. But in my opinion, having a drone will secure the community. I had so many folks from both Park Street, the North End, and the South End who are afraid to go into their backyard or walk down the street. Now, mind you, these drones are not being utilized on a daily basis. This is supposed to be utilized on an emergency basis, maybe a parade, maybe a function in the parks in Bushnell Park. But I've seen fear-mongering on Facebook itself where people are stating that if these drones are out there, they're watching you have a beer or smoke a joint, and you may be arrested. This is not the case here.
I just want to add that what we're talking about is about surveillance technology.
Please don't cut me off. I'm being respectful. So my concern here, my priority is your safety. My priority is my family's safety. And I do care about the privacy of everyone here because a violation of that privacy is a violation of an act, and I do not support that. I do not support the violation of the Privacy Act.
Just wanted to add one quick statement, and it's that this is about surveillance technology. This is about regulating surveillance technology.
So, yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, and I work for the ACLU, which very much cares about privacy. But I'll keep my comments short because I want to be respectful of the community that's supposed to drive the conversation in the next few minutes. If Councilman Sanchez believes in public safety, it's time for him to expand his definition of public safety to also include the protection of people from being over-policed and underprotected, or the potential of that happening. Remember, we had a conversation that this isn't about intent of what the police department uses, right? The goal here is that the council member, his role is to create guidelines in which the department operates in. And there's only one ordinance that actually does that. It sets in clear policy, informed by the very committee that Senator Fanfara sat on in terms of what a nonpartisan research committee staffed by both Republicans and Democrats agreed to that should be the policies that we set for our state. So if Councilman Sanchez truly believes in public safety, expand your definition of what public safety is, support the ordinance in the long form that gets at all of the ways that police department has asked to use drones. There are 8 exemptions for them to use them, and is the only ordinance that actually guarantees the protection of people and restores democratic control over police.
And I just wanted to reiterate the questions from the public. We had the question about the different standards for the police and fire departments surrounding the 4th Amendment. We had the question about future-proofing our ordinances surrounding surveillance technology. We had the question about annual versus more frequent reporting, as well as questions about the uses of drones in automobile accidents and other ways. So I don't know that we'll all be able to respond to all of those things, but I just wanted to raise them to you and offer you the chance to sum up your thoughts in about 1.5 minutes each, please. And I will just start at the end, and we can work our way down. Well, thank you, Senator Fanfara.
I don't think I'll take the full 1.5 minutes, but first of all, I want to thank the sponsors of this event and the moderators for giving up your evening to be part of this. That didn't take up my time, I hope. But, And to this audience, for so many Hartford residents being here, sometimes the audience is mixed in terms of who's actually a Hartford resident, and this was almost unanimous, at least my observation of Hartford residents. Thank you for caring about your city. My hope here is that, in listening, I think I hear that there is a path. I don't know what that is exactly, but that those who have a passionate concern about public safety and those that have a passionate concern about privacy and protecting individual rights, that could be the same person. It doesn't have to be two different people. And I hope that we can find a path as Hartford residents. Sometimes we fight each other. Trust me, I've been in the legislature for a long time. The fight is not among us. The fight is out there, people who don't want to know anything about Hartford and its problems. It's overwhelming. So I hope we can come together and find a way to make our city safer and people feel like they can walk the streets and not be surveilled improperly. I don't believe the police department would intend to do that, but a lot of things aren't intended, but they happen. And I said to Councilman Bermudez earlier that I want to work with her. I want to work with Councilman Sanchez and all the city council members who are here and that are not here to find a way to carve that path where folks can feel good about their city, safe, and feel like they belong here, which they do. So thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you very much. Councilwoman Bermudez, thank you.
Thank you. So I jotted down a couple of the questions. The long ordinance is very much open for all the city departments, any city department that wants to use drones to use it. So in the long ordinance, for example, Hartford Police Department is mentioned in it, the fire department is mentioned in it, our tax assessor's office is also mentioned in it for tax assessment purposes of properties, which is currently happening in different insurance companies as we speak. And so that's one question. So it's allowed for different departments. We just want to make sure that there are checks and balances, that there's regulations, that our rights, our civil rights and our civil liberties are protected, and that if there is error that happens with this new surveillance technology, because it is new, whether it's drones or anything that will be new in the future, that we know how it's being used and that we receive reports, not just an annual report, but that we receive reports, how is it occurring with pre-flight, post-flight. We want this information. As it stands right now, I have not seen the policy for another type of surveillance technology, which is body cameras. And in the long ordinance, we also have provisions so that the surveillance technology policies are placed on the city website, that they are made available to the community. So there's different provisions in the long ordinance. Overall, I completely agree with Senator Fanfara, and I welcome sitting down with you and so many other colleagues in this table to figure out what that middle ground is with your input, because it's about the community input, and that's why we're here.
First of all, I want to thank the host again, as Senator Fanfara mentioned, and the moderator and the panels that are here, and especially the residents of the city of Hartford and those who aren't. You know, those are some great questions, great statements. I do believe that the drones here is specifically will be used for surveying disaster sites, search and rescue, accident and traffic management, dealing with bomb situation and hazardous materials. Also, you know, in situation that happened a few years back, not long ago, Sandy Hook and the Boston Marathon, these are situations that are real. It's real. And we need to try our very best to prevent these kind of situations. And that's another reason why I support drones. So, and to Mr. Siri's point you're right. There is some specific differences between the fire department and the police department. But in general, I think they can be used straight across the board for the same reason when it comes to the security and the safety of our public. Now, as far as the fire department, I wasn't aware there's a tethered drone, which I feel that it could be maybe cumbersome for search and rescue, but nonetheless, it can still be used. And the other thing is also for GIS identification, which we can use that for. Again, I want to thank everyone for being here. I want thank you for those of you that support the drones. I appreciate that. For those of you who don't, I would definitely love to still sit down and have the conversation continue on. This conversation is not going to end tonight. And whether the long or short ordinance passes, it doesn't matter which passes, the conversation must and should continue because, and to your point, the technology will far advance and supersede the ordinances. So it will always be a change.
All right, in 10 seconds or less. I just want to thank again all of you for allowing a non-Hartford resident to be here tonight to share some thoughts from Boston. I will say that I want to thank especially all of the residents who turned out tonight, particularly because it's important that all of you be a part of this conversation. This is your government that we're talking about. This is your police force that we're talking about. And so I certainly believe that it is within your right as a resident of this city to dictate and determine how those two branches should be run. I will just say this. My grandfather once told me that I should not confuse motion with progress, because if I were to push his rocking chair, it would move and not make any progress. Thinking of those words tonight, I am very happy to see, again, all of the residents here, particularly for this conversation. As a lifelong Boston resident, I will say that after the Marathon bombing, everyone there who was not a police officer was very interested in being involved in conversations about how technology was used, especially during the chase for the bombers. Many of us didn't know that our police department had the weaponry and force that they had, and so we're very interested in being involved in that conversation, which is what led to us being involved on the body camera conversation and technology. But to all of the residents here, I would say continue to push your city councilors, continue to push your police department to adopt measures that you believe will protect you and stay engaged. I would also put it to the elected officials to rethink what community involvement means, whether it's just a community meeting or if there are other ways that you're finding to engage community members who work several jobs and have no time to attend nightly meetings or have concerns for childcare. So again, thank you very much for having me tonight. I look forward to Hartford being a leader on this issue. Boston is not moving forward in the way we'd want it to, and so I would say, for whatever my opinion is worth, it's that you beat us on this issue and lead so that we may follow. Thank you very much.
Yeah, but we have a responsibility and a commitment to be open and to have a dialogue, and we will continue to do that. We have to this point. We also have a commitment to be versatile. We had some conversations, and we added the Trust Act language into our drone policy to make sure that there were some safeties in there for our immigrant community. So I want to thank everybody for being here, and I want to just say that we are committed to make sure that we're doing the things that our community and our city leaders are looking for. Thank you.
I'll be super quick because everybody wants to bounce, right? So this is a conversation that should have happened in 2013 when the Fusion Center started. It didn't. It's happening now. It's on you now, incumbent on you, that you know that this conversation is happening, is to get activated. I'm going to hang around. You can find me. Show up at City Council. Let your opinions be known, because that's the only way change happens.